booed Sunday when he took the field in Miami, and it wasn't just because he was in front of the Dolphins' home crowd. Miami is home to a large community of Cuban exiles that are outraged over Kaepernick's comments supporting the man they consider a brutal oppressor, the now deceased Cuban leader Fidel Castro, who died Friday. During a conference call with Miami reporters on Wednesday, Kaepernick defended his choice to wear a T-shirt depicting a meeting between Malcolm X and Castro, praising the dictator for investing in Cuba's education system as opposed to the American investment in the prison system. He spoke to reporters after the 49ers loss and expounded on those remarks, which he said were taken out of context. Quote, "I agree with the investment in education. I also agree with the investment in free universal health care, as well as the involvement in helping end apartheid in South Africa. I would hope that everybody agrees those things are good things in trying to push that false narrative that I was a supporter of the oppressive things that he did is just not true." Max, your reaction?
I supported Kaepernick largely in his protest. It is not okay to lionize Fidel Castro in any way. And it's not, Molly, that Cuban exiles consider him a brutal dictator. It's that he was one. That's what he was. And this revisionist history using the relativism of world governments and how governments don't always behave properly, and even bad governments do some good things. It's absurd to focus or even mention that in his case. It's absurd. You cannot support Castro. Certainly not public. This is not Castro during the Cuban Revolution, who was seen by many, for good reason, as a champion of the people. We have more information since then. He became a communist dictator. And for people like Colin Kaepernick, little knowledge is dangerous. Either he's read a couple books on the subject and that's everything he knows about it, or he knows a lot about the subject and doesn't have the ability to properly process the information. I'm not saying America love it or leave it. I don't go with that crowd. I say America love it or change it. But the fact is, and we all know the history toward people of color in this country, the terrible history and the ongoing struggle. And yet, what we don't see are people risking their lives on rafts to get to Cuba. But we do see that going the other way. And I would quote Dan Le Batard's response on Twitter yesterday to Jill Stein, the presidential candidate, who sent out a tweet lionizing Castro. "Get all the way the hell out of here, lady." And I would say to Kaepernick, with the Castro support in any way, get all the way the hell out of here. If Kaepernick's point is that capitalism has its problems, I would tell him the old expression: capitalism is the worst system, except for every other system in the history of the world. Get all the way the hell out of here with support for a brutal communist dictator.
Before I engage in condemnation about the flaming hypocrite that Colin Kaepernick is, let me cut him a break in this regard. From a black perspective, it matters to a lot of black people. He's not lying about that to a lot of black people. It matters that Fidel Castro met in Harlem with Malcolm X in 1960. It matters that Fidel Castro sent 25,000 troops to Angola to fight, to oppose the old apartheid government of South Africa. It matters to black people that when Nelson Mandela was released after 27 years of incarceration, unfairly, as we all know, that one of the first things that he did in 1991 was travel to Cuba to thank Fidel Castro and the Cuban people for their support. So if you are black and you see support from Malcolm X and you see support from Nelson Mandela, it resonates. It gives you cause to pause. Having said all of that, here's where we go awry. And I would defer to the great column in last Friday's paper in the Miami Herald by Armando Salguero, who writes for the Miami Herald, who is of Cuban descent, along with our friend Dan Le Batard, who I love dearly. Let's be clear. I am not Cuban. They are. And if anybody can speak to their suffering, no matter how eloquent you sound, no matter how eloquent I might try to sound, or you for that matter, Molly, nobody can speak to the suffering of the Cuban people better than them, their ancestry, the people that are connected to them. And I say, when you hear them talk about this dictatorship, this regime, you're talking about dungeons, you're talking about firing squads, you're talking about murder, you're talking about, what is this here? The Human Rights Watch. According to the Human Rights Watch, Cuban citizens have been systematically deprived of their fundamental rights to free expression, privacy, association, assembly, movement, and due process of law. You know, when you hear those kind of things, and you're Colin Kaepernick, and you're talking about the stuff that he's talking about, when your sorry, pathetic behind didn't even have the decency to register to vote, to activate yourself in this election. You know, it's a damn crime that you would even sit up there. I told you to shave that damn afro. Stop acting like you're a militant. You're ignorant. And that's the bottom line. I'm not questioning his intelligence. I'm saying ignorance on the part is he picks and chooses what he wants to disseminate. I'm not saying he doesn't know any better. I'm accusing him of knowing better and not caring. He only cares about what he cares about as opposed to what's real. And when you've got the Cuban folks throughout the United States of America and beyond speaking about how vile this man was and his regime was since 1959, even though he took over, the coup where he got the previous regime out of there and they were torturous, to ignore all of that because of things that you want to isolate and compartmentalize. It's a crime against those people because it reeks of insensitivity. It's incredibly alarming that Colin Kaepernick to choose to do such a thing, and I was happy that Armando Salguero got on him.
I want to respond to one thing you
Sure.
said. Of course, no one can know what the Cuban people go through except for the Cuban people who went through it and their families. But my point of view is people of goodwill all around the world, if Cuban people are being brutally repressed, then we are all Cuban. If little girls are being kidnapped in Nigeria, then I'm Nigerian.
Totally.
If this country wants to make Muslims register, then I'm Muslim.
Well, what I'm saying is
I think people with social conscience have to adopt that position.
You're right. They have to adopt,
Yep.
and then I'll come to you, Molly. You're right. They have to adopt a position. All I was trying to say is that when those very people are in your presence and they can speak to their suffering, there's an elevated and heightened level of sensitivity that from a human perspective, I believe you're obligated to recognize. And the fact that his refusal to recognize that, and, to spout and disseminate, his message, to me, reeks of insensitivity, and it's a damn shame. Go ahead, Molly. I'm sorry.
I also think one thing that he pointed out was Fidel Castro invested in their education system, and they have high literacy rates, which they do. But he also controlled what they were able to read, and they didn't have internet access. And he talked about our prison system, which, yes, it's flawed and it's broken, and how it separates families. Fidel Castro also separated families. I don't know what it's like to be Cuban American, but I know what it's like to have family under communism and to get up early in the morning and send medical supplies and try to send food and try to send money and have it intervene and them calling and crying on the phone. What this man did, Fidel Castro, is he oppressed his people for nearly 6 decades. That legacy is firing squads, it's poverty, it's denying human rights. And last I checked, Cuban Americans are people of color. So I understand when you're talking about African Americans and how there's some sympathy in what he did with apartheid, and which I understand.
Some folks feel that way, not all of us.
But these are also people of color. So when he's going to go out and speak on these subjects, he can't have the surface level knowledge. It's so ill-informed, it's so insensitive, and it's so disrespectful.
Literacy rates are self-reported by the Cuban government.
That's right.
Believe what the Cuban government says?
Exactly. By the way, last point, and I think this is a very, very important point to make, not to get too political, but our president, Barack Obama, reopened diplomatic relations with Cuba, right? Well, what happened in this election? Because we know that Hillary Clinton was an extension of